Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is week 3 of group counseling. And before I begin talking about the psychoanalytic and the Adlerian approaches, just a couple of things about this week. I've gotten several emails and questions, and again, thank you for sharing. Your feedback not only helps Miss Holman and I, but it also kind of lets us know what some of the struggles are, or some of the challenges, I would say. So, from just the different discussions, there's been some concern about kind of the level of work as far as journals, discussion boards, and tests. And I will say that, including myself, at the graduate level, there are, I would say, perfectionist tendencies. We're not looking for perfection, we're just looking for effort. So again, I'm not going to say make a 5-page minimum journal, but please show me effort. And I think that's the distinction that I would like to share, because I really I know everybody's capable of providing a group experience, and part of a journal is to help students really reflect on the growth experience. It's a reflection, it's a self-awareness, it's a time where you can contemplate what it is that you're learning. And I really want to make this a learning experience for everyone. And the second point that I wanted to address was the APA. This class is using Corey. So, one thing that I would just say that to me would be simple is just add Corey into the reference and consider how your group experience or your discussion board, whatever you're writing about that week, ties in to the Corey chapters. So, for example, if I go to a AA meeting and I notice that the facilitator or the peer leader is talking about feedback or kind of some struggles, and I tie it to maybe Corey's concepts that he mentions about open group and how that sometimes creates different dynamics compared to closed groups, then I would just add Corey into my journal, and then at the end I would just add the reference. So again, don't shoot for a 5-page, or some students were telling me, oh, does it have to be 5 pages? No. But from week 1, I've also got some journals that were 2-3 sentences. So, part of the instructions said pay attention to detail, and part of detail is talking about how you react to the situation, how you're processing it, your coping skills, what you notice, what you liked, what you didn't like. I'm not sure how that could be in 3, 4, 5 sentences, but that's part of being detailed, and that's part of a journal. So again, this is part that I really want everyone to work on, and I think everyone can do it. I know that there's been some concerns mentioning, oh, but other professors didn't require APA. And again, part of why I really want to stress that is because when I'm reading, if it's an APA format, it makes it a lot easier to know where everything is, to know kind of the subtitles, and just telling me that you're understanding Corey's textbook and you're reading the materials. So, I really want to clarify that for everyone. I know there's been some questions about that. I've tried to address it with particular students, but I want to mention it in the video. Okay, so moving on now to this week's lecture. And before I get to the lecture, I do want to say that one of the disadvantages of having an online class is that sometimes things can be misinterpreted. Sometimes messages can be taken personally, whereas in a in-class setting, and I'll be honest, when I took group counseling, I did in-class at Commerce, and to me that was very beneficial. So that's one of the challenges of doing online classes, is that sometimes things are posted and they can be taken a certain way which aren't meant. So please keep that in mind. I don't think Ms. Holman or I are here to say something, or even if you took things a certain way, please let us know. We want everyone to be successful, and we want to not only have students grow, but really prepare you for when you're out in the field, because this job is difficult. I can share that 2 weeks ago I got assaulted by a student, and my back hurt for several days. This isn't an easy job, and I've been doing this for several years now, and it doesn't really get any easier. And part of my objective is to prepare you for that, because it's a tough job, and a lot of times it's stressful. I ask myself, sometimes I kind of question myself, but if this is something, true calling, if it's something that you truly want to make a difference, then to me that's my why. So, okay, well, I'll stop talking about that, but let me move on to the chapter. This chapter deals with psychoanalysis, and that goes back to Freud of the 1800s. But with that, there are some contemporary modifications, object relations, which is kind of a hybrid of taking some of the psychoanalytic concepts and making it more to a contemporary theory. So with that, applying that to a group, I'll just kind of give you some of the highlights. The Corey textbook mentions the influence of the past, and this is really important. I know with theories like cognitive behavior therapy, they're always looking at present, but especially when dealing in groups with depression, trauma. I've worked in groups with immigrants. A lot of times there's a lot of complex trauma, not only in their journey, but some of the reasons why they were leaving their native country. And if we don't look at that, or if we just kind of say, "Oh, focus on the now," let's not dwell on something we can't change. I think psychoanalytics would say that sure, we can't change it, but it does affect how we process things currently. And any trauma expert will say that as well. So, that's something that I certainly agree with, and that's something that I think the psychoanalytics have really brought to the forefront. The next thing that was a major concept was the notion of the unconscious, and how I've worked with a group on the unconscious in the past is really talking about how a lot of our behaviors, for example, even simple behaviors like shopping, you know, a lot of times we are impulsive and we don't really think. Maybe we're stressed, maybe we're hungry, maybe we're sleepy. There could be all sorts of factors that decide what I get at a particular store. Even if I have a list, even if they told me go get milk, I might end up getting some chocolate. I might end up getting something else. And a lot of times we don't realize that. So as far as tying that into the group setting, that's an example that I like to use, that a lot of times our behavior isn't really explained through some of the here and now approaches. And I know there's this is beyond the course, but there's groups that deal with interpretation of dream analysis. I had a colleague who was very good at, well, she still is very good at that, and her group work is great. So just remember, psychoanalytics deal a lot with the unconscious and conscious dynamics, how sometimes students, adults do things and that they can't really explain. And I think that's important, especially to talk with, for example, a elementary age kid who's having, let's say, impulsive behavior. A lot of times maybe they feel like, oh, they're different, they're strange, and a lot of times they're called that by peers, and it's important to explain some of that. The other major concept I want to mention with psychoanalytics is the issue of anxiety. So with psychoanalytics, when they talk about anxiety producing, they're really delving into some of the past and some of the past experiences. So how this relates to group work is, for example, if there's a group on depression or trauma, again, one of the things that I've done in the past is talk about how these experiences, let's say, fleeing a dangerous situation, being threatened, seeing a lot of times immigrants that I've worked with, they've seen violence, drugs, murders, a lot of horrific stuff. So a lot of that they take with them. It doesn't just magically go away when they're moving to a new part of, when they move. A lot of that is really related to that anxiety. So again, a lot of that is the unconscious from the past creating that anxiety. Ego defense mechanisms, things like adapting themselves so that they don't feel these things. Going back to the example that I mentioned about the immigrants, a lot of times I've seen that they just get very, very black and white. They start labeling things, either it's good or it's bad. There's no gray. And that's a problem because a lot of times situations are more complex. But for them, because that's how they had to defend themselves from their survival, to them labeling things so simply kind of helps them cope with some of those stresses that they've experienced. So again, talking about ego defense mechanisms in a group setting, I think it's very important. We all have them, and a lot of times in stressful situations, when we're feeling overwhelmed, it tends to come out. It's almost like if you've ever seen, for those that like to cook, a pressure cooker. There's so much energy, and all you see is that little piston in the middle, but that piston's moving so fast that you can tell the whole casserole just has so much energy. And a lot of times, and that's why I was saying about the journal, it's important to write about these things, because if you're stressed, you need to know what stress looks like for you. You need to know what that looks like and how you're coping or not coping, because many times we're stressed and we don't even realize the level of stress that we're under until it kind of dissipates. And the phrase, we're our harshest critics, I think it's very true. We kind of tend to have that self-critical thinking, and a lot of times that's unconscious. So moving on, resistance. I believe we talked about that in last week, but with psychoanalytics, resistance really deals with that reluctance, that should I change? Am I hesitant? What are my pros and cons? Is this for me? Is this safe? A lot of times in a group, clients start to question that, and it's a process. And for a lot of students, let's say in the schools, it's not worth changing at that time. They don't see a benefit to change. So part of the facilitator is to provide that motivation, or really it's to let them at least explore that issue, because part of the facilitator is to let them know of new options, new ideas, better ways of coping with their current situation. Transference and countertransference, that deals with how a group facilitator influences the group, and the group influences the facilitator. So when we talk about transference, a lot of times it's unconscious. We don't realize that it's there. They may remind of, if you're a facilitator, a client may remind you of maybe a past relationship, a family member, someone you've encountered in the past, and you don't necessarily realize, but that affects how you interact or treat that person. So certainly kind of be aware of that. And again, a lot of that is unconscious. We don't realize it. So that's why things like consultation, journaling, being aware of what is going on, having a second facilitator, it's really helpful. And that's why all these things are important, because it helps to kind of check your work, check what you're doing. Free association, that just means that you begin to grab ideas. A lot of times in the schools, I have like a paper that I give students, and it says, I get upset when blank. I get frustrated when blank. And part of that is to get them thinking about examples in their life. I want them to kind of think about, okay, when is the time that they feel this way, and how can they better cope with some of their skills. And that deals with interpretation, because part of what a facilitator is trying to get at using the psychoanalytical method is to interpret how they're using these emotions and try to assist them in their journey and whatever that may entail. Dream analysis, we mentioned that earlier. That's really looking at patterns, looking at different ways of making connections. For example, I mentioned my colleague that does dream analysis. She has a whole literature about it, and she likes to connect things. So if I tell her, I had a dream about I was running and it was dark, and so she would tell me, have you been stressed out? Have you been worried? Things like that. And so looking for patterns, using that unconscious world to try to bring up some of the issues that have been going on in the person's world, and that's really good for group. A lot of times people want to know, and if you're good, or if you read up and if you really study some of these manuals, you can build up a lot of interest with dream analysis. I've seen a lot of groups that really are in demand because people like to make that connection. So again, with the psychoanalytic approach, we're looking at the unconscious, trying to see how different things relate to one another, trying to see how there's relationships, early childhood relationships, and how that relates to the adult, or kind of the whatever population you're working with, that development. And with Freud, Freud mentioned the psychosexual stage, the oral anal latency. With that, with the psychoanalytic approach, it's always important because that's part of looking at that childhood experience. And when you begin to work more and more with individuals, you'll realize how important childhood was. So, to me, there's no question about that. Now, with psychoanalytic, again, there's contemporary approaches. Again, Freud was from the 1800s, but a lot of it has been adapted to more recent times. So object relations, seeing how things relate to one another, seeing how early development, childhood experiences. I know some students mentioned the ACE, adverse childhood experiences, how that relates to when somebody grows up, they're more likely to have poorer health, have higher mental illnesses, all those issues. So to me, that's kind of why psychoanalysis is so powerful, because a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, I think more modern theories really don't put that emphasis that I would say is important. So that is, what I found to be kind of the highlights of the psychoanalytic approach. Again, to me, whenever I think about a group, I may not think, psychoanalysis is my first choice of theory orientation, but I do think it is important. I think the countertransference, transference, attachments, how people deal with their defense mechanisms, how people interpret things, all that really has a base in the psychoanalysis. So again, I think it's a valuable theory, and I certainly apply some of the concepts. Now, moving on to Adlerian, and I know Freud and Adler had well, Adler was trained by Freud, but then he had a disagreement, and he kind of created his own thing. But because it was in similar times in Vienna, we're putting them together. Although just a side note, Adler and Freud were very different. So just keep that in mind. So when we talk about Adlerian, we're really talking about some of his concepts, and his concepts are difficult because it's not really unifying, but just some of the highlights are the feelings of inferiority. As a child, he was a sick child. They thought he wasn't going to make it. His brother was very healthy. He was kind of the opposite, so he always tried to beat death. Similar to Freud, he mentioned compensation, developing a unique style of life, and striving for superiority. And he certainly applied those concepts into his own life. The more I read about Adler, the more I realize how ahead of his time he really was. So how are these are applicable to group work, I would say, is that in a group, like we mentioned previously, there is a lot of questioning, right? Am I ready for change? Is this for me? Is it safe? So that all deals with a sense of belonging. And part of the Adlerian group work is to develop that sense of belongings and to really emphasize that a lot of these issues are interpersonal, whereas Freud really mentioned it was within themselves. Adler saw how societal, the collective unconscious, he called it, how everything is interconnected. And that's what I really admire about Adler, was that he saw the social influences and how we rely on one another to help us out. And this is really important, especially when you're working with minority clients. A lot of times, I would say, for example, Latinos, we have a very collectivist culture, much more so than what I've worked with the majority Anglo culture here. And a lot of times counselors, we make the mistake of not realizing that. We're like, oh, we'll just leave that abusive relationship. It'll be easy, what about her not working? What about her taking care of the children? What about her family not agreeing to all that? There's all these factors, and it's real easy for me to say that, but if I don't understand the interpersonal aspects of that client and the complexities, it's something that I like to keep in mind. So that's certainly important for me. Adler also mentioned things like family constellations, early recollections of childhood experiences and life goals. Again, cheating death. That was big with Adler, and as how I interpreted that as with working with group, is that a lot of times that's important to explain, for example, and to a student. Part of your struggles could be interpersonal, family-based. A lot of times kids internalize a lot of things and they don't know how to express that. So it all just kind of gets bunched up like a pressure cooker. And unless somebody helps them understand some of that and release some of that steam, it can really be very damaging for the person. So as we relate to group work, again, I've mentioned things like what's the position in your family, what's the social interest, encouraging. I think in general, counselors, we don't do enough of that. We don't do enough encouragement. And that's really important because, like I mentioned, change is hard. A lot of times there's a lot of risk to change. Your identity changes, self-concept changes. What if it doesn't work out? Everybody forms an identity, and it's like if I tell you, well, change who you are, how would you take that? So again, it's something that it's important. Now, another thing that Adler mentioned was the goal alignment, and again, I think that's really important. In a group, there's going to be individuals that are in different stages of change, and that's okay. Not everybody's going to be ready for change, but part of the facilitator's kind of role is to understand that, and not only understand it, but be willing to modify. So if I have one student who is ready for change, being very active, doing everything, his identity changes, and then I have another student who's saying, why should I change? This isn't for me. I'm fine. Just kind of not really buying it. Then part of my goal setting for the students is to really talk about that. Okay. For the client who's maybe questioning, maybe a goal would just be to present the information and to really allow the student to explore different options. And for the other student, it may be to continue to grow, continue to form their new self-identity. And that may be completely different goals, but they would be in the same group. So some other techniques that Adler mentioned was the acting as if, and that's similar to the Gestalt empty chair, which we'll be discussing in later weeks. Again, the courage, and that goes along with the reinforcer. It takes courage to change. What's easy is just sitting on the couch watching television. That's what's easy. So the students in this class, it takes courage. It takes courage to enroll in a college and to take classes that really help you keep developing, make you better. Teachers, counselors, that's part of that encouragement. Family constellation, what birth order, family atmosphere, how was the family environment, and Adler talked about something that's super important. It was the holism. And when he talked about that, it's almost like a precursor to Fritz Perls, that the parts are much greater than the whole. Adler certainly believes that. He mentioned that we shouldn't be just looking at behavior. I shouldn't just look at a kid and say, oh, that kid is a terrible kid because of the way he's acting. That's just looking at one part of the child. When I look at a child, I look at the whole child. And for an educator, a counselor, I hope that that's something that's used as well. Social interest, we talked about that. What are their likes? What are they good at? What are their positive traits? One thing that I found as a counselor myself is that people grow through positivity. If I just focus on the negative, if I just tell you how you can't do this, how this, and this, a lot of times you're going to personalize that, and that won't create growth. So again, Adler really talked about that. Mutual respect, respecting not only the person but also where they are in their behavior change. Sometimes, and I see it a lot with beginning counselors, they want the client to change much more than the client wants to change. So you're doing all these techniques, you're motivating, you're doing all that, but there is almost like a two different levels going on because the client isn't really ready for that at this point. And that's part of that mutual respect, is understanding, okay, my client is right here right now. I need to respect that. I need to be professional. I need to do as much as I can, but at the same time, I need to understand that this is that level of change. Okay, so again, that's kind of highlights the Adlerian and the psychoanalysis group counseling chapters. Be sure to read Corey's text. Again, I'm sorry if things were misinterpreted. I certainly didn't want that to occur, and I take full ownership of that. I've had several students call me. If you have concerns, please call, please email. I certainly would like to hear from you and try to help you as much as I can. I think everybody's trying. And again, to me, I understand everybody's has a full-time job, has family, has other things. So, to me, it's always encouraging when you want to go beyond that and pursue a master's, and specifically in counseling, because it's a tough job. Like I mentioned, you can get hurt, the pay's not great, but to me this is a calling, and part of my why is not only helping students but also helping people that want to be in the profession. And I want to not only help you be a good counselor but develop your growth mentality. And part of your growth mentality is understanding that things aren't static, and this is both a learning experience for you and I. So this concludes week 3. Like I said, any questions, please let me know. And thank you so much for listening.